present our guest speaker.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce one of the open education movement's founders, Dr. David Wiley. We saved David for last on our OER for Social Justice series for lots of reasons, not the least of which is because his work has really underpinned so much of what we have all tried to do in this project. We began this project a few years ago by learning about open licenses, and David created the first open license for educational materials in 1998 and served as the first education fellow at Creative Commons. In our first year in this project, we learned about and have been continually practicing the 5 things that open licenses allows us to do. David created that 5 R's framework. And we've looked at data around OER cost savings, and we've worked really hard to build those cost saving programs in each of our institutions. David helped create the first 0 textbook cost degree program. When we began to design and develop the OER for social justice OERs, we wanted to make sure that it was instructionally sound and accessible, and we looked for models and are still looking at these companies like Lumen Learning that David co-founded that model that design. And Dave, who's also an instructional designer, and his companies are continually applying the latest research, of which he's a part, in their designs of instruction. Even when AI brought some disruption and continues to disrupt a little bit, but also brings some possibilities to the OER world, we've talked about and continue to grapple with that. And David has once again taken the lead by investigating and building and testing and openly reporting and sharing all of his AI work. Currently, David is an academic affairs fellow for AI and education at Marshall University. And if you weren't here a few minutes ago, we also noted that he founded the Open Education Conference years ago that provided a space for all of us OER folks to learn and collaborate and celebrate our work for years to come. David also has a day job. He's an associate professor in the Department of Marketing, MIS, and Entrepreneurship at Marshall University. So he is the perfect person to be our final speaker, but there's one more reason why I think David should be speaking to us. And this quick story of how I met him will exemplify this, I think. When I was in my fully online master's program out in Idaho State, zooming in from afar, my classmates and I were learning about these things called open education resources and Creative Commons licenses. And our instructor, who happened to be good friends with David, asked David to join one of our evening Zoom meetings and share about OER and answer our many questions. And this was an evening class that was about 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. David lives on the East Coast. It was, I'm sure, 10 o'clock for him. And the time came for him to join us. And he texted our instructor and said that there had been a thunderstorm with, I think there was a tornado involved. And they had lost power and Wi-Fi, but to hold tight, and he'd try to find a way. So a few more minutes passed in the Zoom room, and all of us are prepared to sign off because surely the late night, losing power, and maybe being in danger, surely this would give anyone a solid reason to postpone, especially someone the caliber of David. But suddenly David's Zoom box appeared, and the first thing it looked like lightning on a dark screen, but we heard this voice from that dark box saying, "Don't be scared, that's just my flashlight. I'm in my basement and I've got my hotspot on, so don't worry, I'm sorry to keep you waiting." And then David Wiley proceeded to talk to a group of random master's students states away by this kind of eerie light up the nose light, all about OER, Creative Commons licenses, and the world of open for over an hour, way past his bedtime. Since that time, David has become a trusted mentor and a good friend of mine. And I tell you this story because the world of open is a generous and humble world. It's a world based on sharing and the understanding that things could always be improved. And it could not come about or be sustained without leaders like David who embody and model that generosity and humility. So David, thank you so much for your generosity of time and energy and sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. Everyone, welcome David Wiley.
Well, I don't know who that guy is, but I want to meet him. That guy you're talking about sounds awesome. But sadly, you just get me for the presentation. I'd totally forgotten about that. That is so funny that you remember that and that you bring that up. It was like, yeah, like the underlighting flashlight, like spooky campfire story vibe. That was wild. Well, okay, so now we're starting off on a happy thought because it actually just makes me, that really makes me smile to think about that. I totally forgot about that. Well, my job today is to try to provoke some interesting thoughts and comments and conversation with you about the future of where OER may be going. Obviously, nobody actually knows what the future holds, especially as soon as you drop OER into the mix. But I want to offer a few thoughts that I hope will be, if not controversial, at least will catalyze some good conversation, and hope to leave plenty of time to have that conversation. And I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat box at the same time that I'm talking, but I know we heard just a minute ago that somebody will. And so as you have questions, please drop them in, because I think the funnest part will be when we get to actually talking about some of these things at the end. Well, let me begin by saying you'll be shocked to know that these slides are an open educational resource. So here's the license for those. I'll have a QR code at the end that you can use to download them, but I'll also send a link to Karna and Teresa. So if somehow you've managed to hear me speak recently, you've heard me sing this song about falling in love with the problem. And I want to keep I think this is a point that's so important for us to keep making as we think about the future. So if you have heard it before, I apologize. But if you haven't, let me tell you a story about falling in love with the problem and not your solution. I teach in the entrepreneurship program here at Marshall, and this is a maxim for people who are starting companies, starting nonprofits, social enterprises. It's so important to fall in love with the problem that you're trying to solve and not your current solution to the problem. And let me tell you a specific story about this. So once upon a time, people had this problem that they needed to solve, which was they needed a way to keep their food cold and keep their drinks cold and maybe medicine and other items. And this is true. At some point in the past, the solution to that problem was there were companies who would harvest blocks of ice from frozen lakes and ship that ice around the country so that it could eventually make its way to customers' homes. This was it was certainly not the original solution to the problem, but it's as far back as I'm going to go in this telling of the story. Later, there were some technological advances made so that we figured out how to actually manufacture ice at scale. And so there could be a factory, like a giant warehouse in town where they could make their own ice. They didn't have to ship it down from frozen lakes. They could make ice there and then, have home delivery for that last mile. Same problem. People still need a way to keep their food and drinks and other things cold. But as technology advanced, we got a better solution to the problem than the solution that we had before. And then, of course, is that technology that they used to create ice at industrial scale got smaller and cheaper. Eventually, there was another solution, which was that we could each actually have a machine in our own homes that was capable of creating its own ice, keeping other things cold. And so you just see this nice progression. The problem stays the same, but as the technology advances, we get better, more convenient, less expensive, more accessible solutions to the problem. And this is actually told as a cautionary tale a lot of the times in the business school, because at each step along the way, there was some company that was really invested in this solution of harvesting ice from frozen lakes and delivering it to customers' homes. And when the technology of producing ice at industrial scale came along, they said, who wants that? Nobody wants their stupid synthetic factory-made ice. People want real ice, the good ice, the kind that we deliver. They were stuck. They were fixated on their solution, and they were unable to see that technology was suggesting more accessible, more affordable answers to that problem. And the same thing happened in this second wave with people that had the big factories that could make ice and store it locally and deliver it. Who would want all the hassle of maintaining a machine in their home? Like, what are they going to do when it breaks down? All of these excuses and reasons why nobody would ever want a refrigerator. They really want us to keep delivering ice to them. And of course, I've put a strike through these first two solutions because they don't exist anymore. And as technology comes along and advances, if we don't see, and if we're not willing to accept that there might be better solutions to our problems now than the one that we were using 25 years ago, we can get left behind too. So we advocate very strongly here in the business school to fall in love with your problem. If you love that problem and you're passionate about solving that problem, every new technology is a new opportunity for you to solve your problem more effectively, more efficiently. But if you fall in love with your solution, then eventually you're going to come into trouble. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve in the open educational resources space? Depending on who you'll ask, you'll get a slightly different version of this. But I think broadly speaking, I mean, we're academics, so we can disagree about anything. But I think broadly speaking, folks would say that the problem is too many people lack access to educational opportunities that could bless their lives in a whole range of ways, make their lives more meaningful, give them greater financial stability, improve their overall health and well-being, let them participate more fully in society, et cetera, et cetera. There's this problem with a lack of access to opportunity. That's a problem. It's a big problem. It's a long-time problem. It's an ongoing problem. And open educational resources is an interesting answer to that problem. So let's talk about increasing access to educational opportunity. Before we get to OER, let's go back in time a little bit. The kind of common, the agreed upon timeline is that the first kind of distance education course was taught in the early 1700s by a fellow called Caleb Phillips. And this was a course where you could learn shorthand, and it was all done by mail. And actually, the technological innovation that made this original distance learning course work was the invention of affordable, regularly sized, regularly priced postage. Like the ability to just buy a low-cost stamp and put it on something and send it. That's the technological innovation that made the original distance education course possible. Skipping way ahead, 200 years later, is maybe one of the first instances in which education was delivered by radio in a formal way. Chicago Public Schools doing courses by radio during a school closure due to a pandemic. Might sound familiar to some of us. And then a couple years later, in the 50s, University of Houston is doing classes via public television. So you can see that there is in our field, well, at least in my field of educational technology, there is this pattern of every time there's a new technology, we try to figure out how can we leverage it to increase access, to broaden access to opportunity for folks. Now, there's relatively little progress made before the 1990s on really dramatically increasing access to educational opportunity because publishing and broadcasting are both expensive and complicated. Like in the case of publishing, at that point in time, you needed a press. In the case of broadcasting, you need antennas and other infrastructure. You need a license from the FCC. Like it's very complicated and it's very expensive to broadcast these kind of educational resources. But the advent of the internet democratizes all of that. Democratizes publishing. You don't need a printing press anymore. You just need a blog. It eventually democratizes broadcasting. You don't need antennas and an FCC license. You need a YouTube channel. And now you can be broadcasting as well. So the internet really creates this step change in the number and the amount of people that can participate in publishing and broadcasting. So many years ago, I was here at Marshall University and I had this epiphany. And this is just kind of my personal story. But I just want to share 2 or 3 slides worth of it with you. I was sitting in a building across campus. I was the university webmaster, and I was coding up a little JavaScript calculator that was going to be embedded in a web page. And I had this realization that there was something really fundamentally different about a calculator embedded in a web page, and the physical calculator that we might have used at my elementary school, where maybe we had 5 of them, but there were more than that in the class. So you had to wait your turn for the calculator to come around to do something with it. Um, when you take something that's physical and you make it digital, it suddenly gains all these magical properties. So if you think about the news for a minute, if you're sitting at the table and your significant other has one section of the newspaper and is reading it, you can't read it until they're done with it. You have to compete for access to this physical resource. But if I take that same news and instead of printing it on paper, if I just put it on a website, literally 1 million people can all read it at the same time. We don't have to compete for access anymore. Scarcity disappears as an issue. And it just seemed to me like this is like magic. Now, lots of people understood that before me. Economists have a whole vocabulary for talking about it. But when it just hit me as I was working on that calculator, it hit me in a really profound kind of way and got me thinking about a lot of things. This was the time, this was a couple of years before, but in the same kind of 3 or 4 year period of time when Napster started taking off, right? People realized, hey, if we digitize things, then we can share them with millions of people. Everybody loves music. Let's digitize music and share it with millions of people, which technologically is possible. And as a technology project was very successful. But it turns out that just because sharing is easy doesn't mean that it's legal. And so some people got sued into oblivion over their use of tools like Napster and LimeWire and some of those early sharing tools, because just because sharing was easy, thanks to the magic of digital, didn't mean that it was legal. Well, actually, I'm not even going to talk about the Berne Convention. I'm just going to keep going. In the summer of 1998, well, going back a little earlier, in February of 1998, some people got together to talk about what was happening in the world of software and how they could talk about it in a way that would be persuasive to people, that they might want to participate in this kind of more contributory, participatory method of developing software. And coming out of this February 1998 kind of strategy session, someone said, let's call this thing open source software. And we'll go and we'll take this message of open source and start talking about it to everybody and try to convince them that this is the way we should do software. And I heard that and I thought, that's brilliant, but why would we stop at software? Like, we should do more than software. We should do literally anything that you can make. Like, we should do pictures, we should do video, we should do textbooks or any kind of book or journals or poems or whatever it might be. So just a couple months later, after the open source software meeting, I said, I went to Slashdot, which was the place, it was like the Reddit sort of the day. It was where everybody was talking about things, and said, in addition to open source, let's do this other thing. I'm calling it open content. We can call it whatever we want to call it, but maybe you've got some educational content you'd like to make freely available for others, maintaining ownership, assuring proper recognition. Here's this new open content license. Let's see what we can do here. And so I started trying to promote this idea that we should start sharing things under open licenses, things like educational materials. So in 98, I released the Open Content Principles and License, which a lot of people talked about, but not a lot of people adopted. The year after that, I worked together with Eric Raymond, who was one of the founders of the open source software kind of work. And we worked together to create the Open Publication License, which was much more popular. There are lots of books and things that were published under the OPL. After that came the GNU Free Documentation License, for those of you that know about the free software, as kind of a parallel universe to open source software. And then later in 2022, the Creative Commons licenses came along. But this idea, developed, and lots of people got excited about it and really started taking off. We should share educational materials with each other. And so the reason I share that whole story with you is just to make the point that the internet made sharing easy, but it didn't make sharing legal. We had to invent open licenses in order to make sharing legal, so that you, as the copyright holder, because whether you like it or not, Anytime you create something, you're automatically endowed with copyright. If you're making something for the express purpose of sharing, it doesn't matter, you're automatically assigned copyright protection. And now you have to go out of your way to put an open license on it so that other people know that they can engage in 5R activities and do whatever they want. So the internet made sharing easy. The work on open licenses made sharing legal. So now it's legal and easy. And now 27 years later, like, there are hundreds of thousands of people involved. I don't know if there are millions of people involved, but there are a lot of people involved in this work. 2.5 billion works have been published online under an open license, according to the last count that Creative Commons does in conjunction with search engines. Just in US higher ed in the last 10 years or so, OER textbooks went from being used in about 1 in 400 classes to 1 in 50. And in informal learning contexts, we know that OER have been accessed by people just looking for homework help or trying to teach themselves. But in these kind of informal learning contexts, literally billions and billions of accesses to open educational resources. So we've done a lot to improve access. But several years ago, I started kind of getting worried about where open education was going. We were kind of laser focused on access, but we weren't talking a lot about student success. And if you stop back and look at the data on student success in the United States, it is not great. The Department of Education in the past has collected and reported on data where they look at the rates at which students graduate from programs in 150% time. So for a 4-year degree program, they look at how many people graduated in 6 years. And those percentages are pretty low, and they're a lot lower for some subgroups than they are for others. And the situation is even worse if you look at 2-year student success rates within a 3-year period of time. So again, graduation within 150% time. And at some point, I just started feeling like is what we really want to do say, hey, look, same dismal success rates, but now more affordable. We've increased access to this program that only 1 in 4 of you will graduate from. 2 in 3 of you will graduate from. It seemed like we needed to, if not change our focus, at least significantly expand our focus. Now you might say, well, David, that's easy because adopting OER improves student outcomes. And I'm here to tell you that no, it doesn't. And so this is something that I imagine we might talk a little bit about later on, but give me a couple slides to try to persuade you that it doesn't. There are some real problems with OER research, including some of the research that I did early in my career when I was very excited about OER and was not being as methodologically rigorous as I should have been. So it's true that there are dozens of studies that show that adopting OER improves outcomes, but if you read them critically, and by that I just mean if you just read them and look if they're methodologically sound or not, you will find that OER research is typically riddled with methodological problems. And I want to talk about 3 of the most common in this little section here. For the first of these, I'd like to conduct the simplest possible thought experiment with you. So I pulled a book off the shelf. This is educational research by Gall et al. From way back in the day. And I just took a picture of the copyright page. This is a pullout of the copyright page of this book that's on my shelf at home. I don't know if there's any data on how effective this book is at supporting students in learning educational research, but let's say that it has some degree of effectiveness. Whatever it is, I don't know, but it has some degree of effectiveness. Now watch very closely. When I do this, have I improved the effectiveness of that book? When I change its copyright from all rights reserved to License CC BY, you may now engage in the 5R permissions. Is this book now more effective than it was 30 seconds ago when it was fully copyrighted? The answer is no. It is not. Copyright, there's no reason. Well, let me not use my words. Let me use the words of some researchers from Rice University from the OpenStax team. The Rice University folks, Phil Grimaldi was the lead author. I think he's like head of research at Khan Academy now, but he was at OpenStax before, and he and several of them wrote a paper about what they called the access hypothesis. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes at you, and I apologize. I know that's bad form, but I'm just going to read a couple of quotes to you from the paper here. The primary goal of OER is to offer an alternative to commercial textbooks that are comparable in quality but free and openly licensed. Assuming an OER textbook is no different in quality, then there are no meaningful differences to explain effects on learning outcomes. License and costs certainly should not affect learning at a cognitive level, right? An open license doesn't change whether I'm employing evidence-based teaching strategies or not. Now, the price of a textbook can affect whether a student decides to purchase, and a student cannot learn from a book they can't afford. Thus, adoption of OER would be effective as a learning intervention because it ensures that all students have access to the textbook and therefore would result in better outcomes. We refer to this idea as the access hypothesis. Okay, so the idea that you can't learn from a book you can't afford, people can't afford their textbooks, so by making it free, we actually are going to improve outcomes. They call that way of thinking, they call that the access hypothesis. The access hypothesis predicts that an OER intervention should only affect a subset of students, specifically those who would not otherwise have access to the textbook. So think about a class that you've taught. Think about all the students in that class. Some percentage of them, if you were using TCM instead of OER, some percentage of them would have purchased. Some percentage of them would loan from the library. Some of them would borrow from a friend. Most of them would end up getting access to the textbook in one way or another. A handful of them will literally have no access whatsoever to the materials. So the access hypothesis here predicts that an OER intervention should only affect specifically those students who would not otherwise have access to the textbook. Students who are willing or able to purchase should not be affected. Right? If your hypothesis is that by increasing access, you're going to increase outcomes, you can't increase access for students who would have had access, even if you'd assigned TCM instead of OER. Okay. But OER efficacy research typically compares an entire sample of students who received OER to an entire sample of students who did not. So to draw an analogy, and I think this is the last quote, to draw an analogy, the current research approach in OER is the equivalent of measuring the effect of a pain-relieving drug on a sample of people who are mostly not in pain. So for example, in a class of 36, if you had 6 students who would otherwise have had absolutely no access to the textbook, and you're looking for learning gains between that class that got OER and the class that didn't get OER, the learning gain for those 6 students would have to be so large that it would be detectable even when it's hidden among those 28 students who experienced no learning gain because they didn't have any increase in access. They were going to have access already. This is the Rice University team's argument. So when you see access hypothesis style research articles, and those articles where they say, look, we adopted OER, we had this OER program, whatever it was. When you see research that seems like it's built around this access hypothesis and you see a large difference in outcomes, you immediately know there's something other than OER that's responsible for that difference. There's no way that the small number of people, even if they would have all gotten Fs before and now they all get As, that change from F to A of 6 people among 60 is not enough to create a drastic difference class-wide. Okay? So there must be something else going on. That's the end. That's kind of the end of the Rice University argument. Let me share kind of 2 specific observations with you about that. What is it that might be driving that huge impact? So which has a bigger impact on student learning, their instructor or the textbook that is chosen by their instructor? Obviously, the instructor is the larger factor in student learning. However, in the overwhelming majority of OER studies, faculty choose whether or not they want to adopt OER. There's no randomization. Like we don't take 5 faculty and randomly assign them to use OER and 5 faculty and tell them they randomly have to keep what they're doing. We don't do any kind of propensity score matching or any other kind of matching technique. We just say, these faculty used OER, these didn't, and let's talk about what happened to the students who used OER. Well, when there's no randomization, there's no matching, no proper control, it's literally impossible to separate the influence of the instructor from the influence of the OER or the TCM, the traditionally copyrighted materials. The instructor effect and the materials effect are perfectly confounded. So any differences in student learning that are attributable to the impact of instructors can't be distinguished from the impact of course materials. In other words, what I mean is when you read a research study about OER and all the faculty got to choose for themselves if they were going to use OER or not, you cannot know if that study tells you that students that use OER perform better, or if students who take classes from the kind of instructors that choose OER do better than students that take classes from other kinds of instructors. There's literally no way to separate those two questions from each other the way that 95% of OER research is done and reported. That's a problem. If it turns out that it's the more innovative, open-minded, forward-thinking faculty that adopt OER, are any of us surprised that students that take classes from the more open-minded, forward-thinking, innovative faculty do better than students that take them from other faculty? I don't think any of us would be surprised by that. And then, of course, I got to talk about instructional design. Most studies, in fact, maybe every single study, tells us literally nothing about the course materials being studied beyond their copyright licenses. These students used OER, these students used the same old TCM that their faculty were using before. Of course, differences in instructional design create huge differences in learning outcomes. If the students using OER are using OER in the format of a printed textbook, and the students using TCM are in some kind of like Pearson MyLab environment where it's adaptive and there's lots of practice and real-time feedback that diagnoses their misunderstanding, what do you think is going to make the bigger difference? The change in licensing or the fact that one person's getting a personalized adaptive experience and the other is looking at a printed book? Or if one class is taught in a very lecture-heavy format, standing at the front of the room showing PowerPoints, and another was doing active learning all throughout class. There's literally no way to know from these studies because they don't report anything about the design of the materials or what's happening in the class. They just tell us these folks use OER, those folks didn't. Wow, look at the big difference that OER makes. So when you see a study that doesn't tell you anything about the course materials beyond their licensing, you have to ask yourself, is this study telling me that students that use OER perform better than students that use TCM? Or does it tell me that students who use course materials designed according to evidence-based practices perform better than students who don't? Because guess what? The students whose materials are designed according to evidence-based practices are going to do better every time than the students who have materials that aren't. The way that most OER research is reported, there is literally no way to know the difference. So 3 questions I'd recommend you ask anytime you read OER research. And if you have a couple of OER research papers that you really love, that are your favorite, that you share with policymakers, you share in presentations, that you do things with, go back and look at that paper and ask yourself these questions. Have the researchers either measured or estimated the proportion of students who would have had no access to course materials, if this is an access hypothesis kind of study? Have they even estimated how many students they think they're impacting? Because it's not the whole class. If they did measure that or at least estimate it, did they control for it in some way? That's question one. Question two, did the researchers explain how assignment to treatment and control groups worked? If the assignment wasn't random, did they at least do some kind of propensity score matching or use some other technique to control for what might be systematic differences across the groups? Third question you might ask is, have the researchers described anything about the instructional designs of the course materials being compared? And if the answer to any of those questions is no, you could argue that that research doesn't tell you anything useful. And with most of the OER research, the answer to all three of those questions is no. We need to be doing better quality research. Now, there are a handful of what I consider very rigorous studies, and the links are in the notes to the slides, so you can go look at them later. But for my awareness, the limited number of large-scale studies with sufficient controls, either randomization or like responsible matching, appropriate analyses, show no significant difference in student outcomes. Everybody saves money, but nobody does any better. And now, I'll be the first one to say that saving money is amazing, and you should save money every time that you can save money. You should do that. But I'm worried that we're so focused on increasing access that we're missing the thread on improving student success. And the research that we're doing is, and again, I'll raise my own hand. Some of the research that I did earlier in my career was not sufficiently rigorous to really tell us what we need to know. We need better, we need research that looks more like the studies that are listed in the notes of this slide here. So how do we go from thinking about only increasing access to also thinking about actually improving outcomes? What would you say, is an encyclopedia article an information resource or an educational resource? And I'm going to see, where did my controls go? I'm actually going to stare at the chat for a moment here. Is an encyclopedia article an information resource or is it an educational resource? And what's the difference between an information resource and an educational resource? What would the difference even be between those two kinds of things? And if you're looking for a toehold to answer this question, I would say put on your instructional designer hat if you have one as you think about the answer. What's the difference between a resource that's an information resource and one that's an educational resource? Well, we've got a tough one, and we've got a couple of information resources in the chat. I'm going to argue that an encyclopedia article really is an information resource. It describes facts, it explains concepts. It's very presentation oriented, right? Ideally, it's accurate, it's well structured, it's clearly written. For me, as an instructional designer, for something to not only be an information resource, but to be an educational resource, it needs to be an information resource plus have another layer of things on top of it. And that layer is practice and feedback. When I read an encyclopedia article, right? When I read a Wikipedia article, very informative, but it doesn't prompt me to check my understanding. It doesn't ask me to step back and think about whether I've understood or not. It doesn't give me feedback to know whether I have understood or not, or make suggestions about what I might do to improve my understanding. I think that educational resources are information resources plus practice and feedback at a minimum. Now, there's a lot more that you could do, but I'd say at a minimum, if you don't have practice and feedback, you might have really high quality information, but you don't have an educational resource. So, and if you think about a lot of the open educational resources that you've seen, or at least the material that gets created in the context of open educational resource programs, a lot of them are information resources, not educational resources. There's not a real focus on a lot of practice on ways of providing feedback. We're getting better at that. We've been getting better at that for the last couple of years. But if we actually want to change the effectiveness of the materials, or if we want to change the impact the materials have on student learning, we have to change the instructional design of the course materials. So we all know there are several kind of tried and true ways of studying a textbook, whether it's print or digital, doesn't matter. You read it, you highlight it, you reread it before the exam. But highlighting and rereading are proven to be some of the least effective ways you can study in terms of return on investment of time, right? There are other things you can do, like even flashcards, a much higher rate of return on the time you spend studying than highlighting and rereading. Any kind of retrieval practice, for example. But there's decades of research also looking at things like intelligent tutoring systems, systems that adapt in some way to the student, showing that those like systems like ITSs can actually dramatically improve student learning. But it's not because they use technology, it's because they use a significantly different instructional design, right? So they adapt instruction in response to learner performance. They provide a lot of practice, a lot of real-time, immediate feedback, remediation based on that feedback. Some even change in response to emotional and motivational cues that they pick up on from students. But from the time that these have been invented, there actually has not been a ton of progress because they're super expensive to build and they're really complicated to build. And they typically only operate in one domain. You could spend 3 years developing an ITS to teach college algebra. And if you turned around next year and started working on one to teach trigonometry, you'd be 3 years again. There's like almost no benefit from building the one to building the next. But hang on a second. We said a minute ago something about there not being a lot of progress because of things being expensive and complicated when we talked about publishing and broadcasting, right? We said there is not a lot of progress on making access to materials more affordable and increasing access to materials because of the expense and complication of printing and broadcasting, that the internet democratized publishing and broadcasting, and the open licenses then democratized sharing all of that. I think maybe when it comes to improving outcomes, there's something similar here. There's been relatively little progress because adaptive systems have been so expensive and so complicated to create. But I think that the advent of generative AI democratizes the creation of these kinds of systems the same way that the internet democratized publishing and broadcasting. Andre Karpathy, who's probably the best follow on social media about generative AI, if you're interested in a slightly more technical view of this topic, started talking a couple of years ago now about the fact that the hottest new programming language is English. And just by writing carefully constructed prompts and providing sufficient additional context, there's a lot that you can do with a generative AI model without writing any computer code. It's a very, very different world than it was just 2 or 3 years ago. So how might generative AI help us with the first part of the mission, which is increasing access? Well, do any of you know the Drake equation, just by show of hands? Anybody know the Drake equation that I've got on the screen here or have heard of it? It's this really fun thing that is trying to predict. Well, people use it to talk about the likelihood that we will ever communicate with intelligent aliens, right? And the way to think about it is as this giant funnel, right? So there's some rate of star formation in the galaxy, and some fraction of those stars have planets, and some fraction of those planets might potentially support life. And on those that could potentially support life, some fraction of them will develop life. Some fraction of that life will become intelligent, right? It just kind of keeps funneling down and down and down and down until we get to, the fraction of civilizations that will develop a technology that releases detectable signals into space. And then we also have to include the length of time it takes for them to travel. And I think the idea of the Drake equation is to try to convince you that the odds of us ever having this phone call are very low, right? But there's a Drake equation of OER, right? When you need an open educational resource on a specific topic for your specific group of students, first you have to hope that somewhere, someone else in the world has created that resource that you need. Then you have to hope that they openly licensed it. Then you have to hope that they've published it online where Google can find it, or that they put it in a repository with sufficient metadata. Then you have to hope that you either stumble onto that repository somehow, or that you actually manage to find it through Google. Like, it's this whole kind of winnowing down funnel again. Now, if you're looking for introduction to psychology, like, congratulations. There's 10,000 OER out there waiting for you. But once you get past the general education courses, it really starts to feel a lot more like a kind of Drake equation. However, with generative AI, you can say to generative AI, I need a resource on this topic at this reading level in this language, and I want to use this specific kind of examples for this specific group of learners. Go, and it can create it for you. Now, will it be perfect the first time that it, comes out of the pipe? No, it'll need some reworking. But I'll remind you that every OER that you find, you're dissatisfied with when you find it, and you end up reworking that OER a little bit before you use it in your class as well. So for the last 25, 27 years in the OER space, we've run this OER Drake equation funnel, praying that when we get to the bottom of it, we're going to find what we need. And with generative AI, we can literally just very specifically ask for what we want and get something that looks like, at a minimum, a very strong first draft of what we want. And that is a significant increase in access. So generative AI is impacting the work that we do with OER in a whole bunch of ways. If you think about OER as being articles, chapters, essays, textbooks, images, all the things we typically think about with OER, generative AI can affect the way that we author them, the way that we revise them, and the way that we remix them. Right? So in terms of authoring, it's just like I was saying. Before, if you wanted to create an OER, you needed grant funding and a course release and 6 months and something else, and then you could create something that approximated a textbook that you might get from a commercial publisher. But with generative AI now, you're still going to draft a table of contents and an outline, maybe a detailed set of learning outcomes, but it's going to write the draft for you. And then with that draft, you're going to do the same things that you would have done with the first draft that you wrote by hand. You're going to send it out for peer review. You're going to have it proofread. You're going to do whatever. So even if you only argue that AI is only useful for producing first drafts, using generative AI should make us at least an order of magnitude faster at getting to that first draft. And by order of magnitude, I mean literally take the amount of time it took you to before, divide it by 10, and I'd say that's the upper limit on the amount of time it's going to take you to get there. And I think we'll find, because people in philanthropy are always interested in being effective philanthropists and effective stewards, that as OER programs, if they continue to exist in some form, that there will be requirements that AI be used in the drafting process there, because if you've only got so much grant money to give, and you could grant to 10 people if they would use AI to draft their OER, but only 3 people if they insist on writing every word by hand, probably going to wish that you could do more good in the world with that limited amount of money that you have. And then revising and remixing, I think, have always been interesting. Open licenses make it legal to revise or to remix, but they don't magically give you the expertise that you need to revise or remix. So if you need to translate a resource into another language, an open license will let you do that, but it doesn't make you fluent in Spanish, right? If you need to create interactive resources based on static resources, if you don't know how to do that, it's great that OER give you permission, or if you need to adjust the reading level or the other kinds of changes that you might make. But these are exactly the kinds of changes that generative AI is great at making, right? Adjusting the reading level, translating into another language, creating interactive resources based on static resources that you would put in there. Time and effort have always been obstacles to this, right? And some research that some of my dissertation students have done in the past has shown, now this should surprise literally no one, the more time and effort are required to engage in a specific kind of revise or remix activity, the less often faculty engage in that activity. So for example, in a system where OER textbooks are preloaded and there are tools there for revising and remixing, faculty are dramatically more likely to delete a chapter or to drag a chapter from here to there than they are to write a new chapter or to make extensive revisions, right? There's a straight line relationship between the amount of time it takes to make a change and the percentage of people who make that change. So if time and effort are really the primary obstacles to revising and remixing, then the existence of AI should mean we're going to see a 100%, 200, some huge increase in the amount of revising and remixing if time and effort have really been the obstacles, which I think to some degree they have been. Generative AI just makes it so much faster, which means we should see more of it. And we should also see better quality revise and remix too, because the little bit of research that's been done on the generative AI side, looking at productivity gains from people using generative AI, have shown that the productivity gains are highest among the lower skilled workers. Again, that shouldn't surprise anyone. But for example, on a translation task, Gen AI will give you a much greater productivity gain if you don't speak the language you're trying to translate into than it will give you if you're fluent in the language, right? So in as much as generative AI makes these tasks that were impossible or impractical to do before because I didn't have the expertise or the skill that I needed to do it, if I can lean on generative AI for that skill, now we should expect to see an increase in the variety of revising and remixing and the quality of revising and remixing that needs to happen. And for 10,000 bonus points, that will count toward your final grade for this presentation, in the chat, somebody described the difference between revising and remixing. I'll keep going while you do that. So thinking about how generative AI could impact OER, I think if you put these two notions together, we start to come to a place where we're not just increasing access, but we can get serious about increasing student success as well. And so I want to propose to you, I don't love the name generative OER, but I haven't heard anything better yet. Hopefully, maybe one of you will come up with something that's super catchy and will take the world by storm. But the idea is that I think there's now a new family of a new kind of resource that is, it's not designed to be used by students or faculty directly for teaching, learning, or research, like we talk about in the definition of OER. But these are resources that are designed to be used by a generative AI system in order to create either OER or create learning experiences that adapt to learners in real time. So by that, I'm talking specifically about prompts that would be openly licensed, and I'm talking about model weights that would be openly licensed. Now, Teresa, you said as many as 90 minutes, right?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, because I want to make sure there's plenty of time for talking, but if there's enough time, I want to make this last handful of points here. Open prompts, when you as a novice user, when you write a prompt for ChatGPT, you tell it something like write an essay about the cause of World War II. And that is great. But if you want a large language model to engage in a more complex behavior, like a 15-minute long tutoring session that follows a specific structure, your prompt is going to be hundreds or maybe thousands of words long. And as soon as you get into the hundreds or thousands of words, our old friend copyright shows up again. And now your prompt is automatically copyrighted because it's a meaningful creative work. So that means that if we're going to be sharing prompts around with each other, adapting them, reusing them in our own circumstances, et cetera, we're going to have to openly license them if we want to do that legally. And the ability to do that really matters for all the same reasons that people in our community understand why we need permission to localize traditional OER for linguistic reasons, for cultural reasons, for other reasons. For all the reasons that the 5 Rs are important for normal OER, they're also important for prompts. And it's also true that not every user will use the same AI model. Some will use Copilot, some will use Claude, some will use ChatGPT, some will use Gemini, Llama, you name it. So because I'm going to be using prompts with different models, it's also going to be important that I'm able to tweak the prompt so that it works with the model that I need to use it with. I need to refine the prompt to get it to behave exactly the way I want it to behave with my model when you wrote it to work with a different model. That's another reason why I need 5R permissions to engage in the work that I do with prompts. Now, weights are just as important, maybe even more important, but it's a little more technical. And I don't want to go into it very deeply at all, but I'm happy to, in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about it more. A generative AI model is a giant matrix of very high precision numbers, like this number here. And conceptually, it's like if you've taken a statistics class, it's like beta weights that you get when you do a linear regression. But there are billions of these arranged in matrices, and that collection of numbers organized in those matrices are what we refer to as model weights. And they're the brains of the model. And so if we take those model weights and we openly license them, then it means that other people can download the brains of the generative AI model and teach it new things, teach it new skills, teach it new content, new behaviors, new attitudes and values. And that seems like it will be super important. Now I'm going to skip over, again, the difference between revising and remixing. And I just want to make the point, and I'll keep going, that there are clear analogs of revising and remixing when it comes to working with open weights, quantization in the case of revising, fine-tuning in the case of remixing, or even distillation. If you want to talk more about these, I'm super happy to talk about it later, but I feel like we're kind of crunching for time here. But open weights really matter because the foundation models, like just the generic model that you have access to when you go to ChatGPT, that model is not designed to behave pedagogically. Right? That model might lack specialized disciplinary knowledge that you want it to have, or cultural knowledge that you need it to have, or pedagogical knowledge that you want it to have in terms of how it's going to teach and how it's going to respond in certain situations. And so we can write prompts and we can do context engineering that temporarily improves a model's knowledge or its behavior. But if we want to permanently change a model's knowledge or behavior, we have to be able to fine-tune it. And in order to do that, we need legal permissions. We need open licensing on the weights of the model so that we can create permanent changes to the way that those models behave and respond and what they know and what they value. And the last thing that I'll say about open weights is that when they're not copyrighted, then not only can we revise and remix them, we can retain them and we can reuse them. So you can right now today, you can go download open model weights to your laptop, put your laptop, turn off the Wi-Fi, unplug from the wall, and just on your laptop, run your own large language model on your laptop using an open weights model. And when you're doing everything locally and you're completely disconnected from the internet, that improves privacy, it decreases energy consumption, it addresses a whole range of concerns that people in the open space might have. But it also really dramatically improves access for people that don't have an internet connection. A number of years ago, I worked with some schools in Nepal that had computers and they had electricity, which actually electricity was a thing that had only very recently come to the school, but they'd gotten some used computers and they'd set them up in a little local area network, but they had no connection to the internet. And so we would take OER and like load up thumb drives with OER and take over to them or mail to them. We did it both ways. And if they plug that thumb drive into a server, now everybody in the school has access to that OER on the little local area network. Well, this is the same thing. If I can download a large language model and the code that's needed to run it onto a thumb drive and drop it in the middle of nowhere, even if I don't have internet access, now I can still benefit from generative AI no matter where I am in terms of connectivity to the network, as long as I have a computer. So, we think about repositories when we think about OER. I would say, when you think about generative OER, think about things like prompt libraries as repositories. Think about a site like Hugging Face, where there are literally tens of thousands of open weights models that people have uploaded. And then somebody else has downloaded it and tweaked it and changed it so it behaves more this way, or it knows more about this, and they've re-uploaded it. And they're sharing tons of these open models with each other. Lots of interesting stuff going on here. And then there's the impact of generative OER on pedagogy, right? So you may have heard me talk in the past about OER-enabled pedagogy, or maybe you've read about that, but OER-enabled pedagogy is the idea that there's some pedagogies that you can only engage in when you have permission to engage in the 5R activities with regard to your teaching materials. Well, there's been an evolution of the ways that pedagogy has changed kind of over the course of the history of OER. First, the internet kind of famously removes time and place as barriers to education, right? The whole thing about the internet was you can do your school at home at midnight in your bunny slippers, right? The internet took away time and place as barriers. OER removed copyright restrictions as barriers. Pedagogy has evolved a little bit in response to that. I want to propose to you that generative AI removes access to expertise as a barrier. And the simplest possible example of that is 4 years ago when it was midnight, I was doing my homework that was due the next day. My instructor, of course, wasn't online. My study group wasn't online. I couldn't find an answer on Reddit. Like, I was just stuck because I could not find somebody who could answer my question. Generative AI removes that access to expertise as a barrier. And now, at any time and place, you can get answers to the overwhelming majority of the questions that you might want to ask. So, in addition to OER-enabled pedagogy, I think there's also a Gen AI-enabled pedagogy. And this would be the things that you can do with Gen AI that you can't do otherwise in terms of your pedagogy. And what would that even mean? Here's an example. So we typically don't assign synchronous collaborative activities in our asynchronous online courses. Like, I can't assign a think, pair, share in an online course where the people never show up at the same time. But if I can prompt generative AI in such a way that I can get it to act as a partner, now I can assign a think, pair, share or another synchronous collaborative activity in my asynchronous online course. That's the thing I could not do before generative AI that I can do now. So and that's just like the simplest possible example. But there are things that it lets us do that we couldn't do before. And I think it will be super interesting as we write these prompts and capture the directions that we're giving to ChatGPT or to Copilot or whatever. It turns out that that process is actually a way of reifying our pedagogy. We have to say exactly in this circumstance, react this way, approach the conversation this way, respond in this way, ask this kind of question. It's actually a very detailed documentation of your pedagogy. And having that kind of documentation will allow us to then share it around and analyze and replicate and compare and do things we've never been able to do before. Now, I'm not claiming that all pedagogies can be implemented through generative OER, but I think a bunch of them can. And I think this ability to externalize our pedagogy in a way that's replicable by someone else with access to a model opens up research and evaluation possibilities that we've we've never seen before. Okay, going. In conclusion, and you can look at the slides I'm skipping because I feel like we're running out of time. So kind of first in conclusion point about democratizing progress. The internet democratized publishing and broadcasting. Open license democratized sharing. I think generative AI is going to democratize authoring of these adaptive learning experiences. Each of these technological advances gave us greater capacity to increase access to educational opportunity and to improve outcomes. And because it's possible, I feel like we have an obligation to do it. So, kind of my parting thought to you before we start talking is to say, let's be in love with the problem of trying to increase access and the problem of trying to improve outcomes, and not be hung up or obsessed with our solution of the last 25 years, which has been OER the way that you think about it today. It really is possible for us now to begin creating these personalized adaptive learning experiences. It's easier than it has ever been before. Multiple, like maybe take the amount of effort it took before and divide by 1,000. And it's that much easier to create this kind of experience with a large language model than it would be to have created an ITS in the 70s or in the 80s when they started doing that. And then we can actually openly license them and share them with each other. And just as a word of encouragement, when you create traditional OER, you sit down and you're thoughtful and you're careful and you type words. Well, when you create open prompts, you're also being careful and thoughtful and typing English words. Like I'm not asking anyone to go learn Python or become a computer scientist or something. This is something that everyone can do. You can explain clearly and explicitly what your pedagogical approach is in a way that some portion of it can be replicated by a model. And then instead of creating one explanation of a concept that uses one example that will speak to one group of students, in that same amount of time, if you instead created a prompt that could explain that concept in different languages, using different examples for different groups of students, maybe that's an idea that we should be excited about. And you can absolutely do it. Prompt writing is not, it's just not that technical. This is something that we can all do, and I think is very much where the future of OER is going. So, okay, we've got like 20 minutes we can talk. Finally, I will shut up and I can hear what you guys and gals are thinking and responses that you have. But not all, you're talking over top of each other. I can't understand you, not all at once.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If we can all give a round of applause to Dr. David Wiley, we really, really appreciate it. Just a few reminders. Feel free at this time to turn your video on if you'd like. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand using the Zoom, or you can also put it in the chat and we'll read the question for you.
That's a lot of clapping. Thank you, guys. So what if that provoked a response? What do you want to talk about?
Misha.
Thank you, David. That was very interesting, and like I love the way you present stuff. It was just very easy to follow. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I smart a little when you get into the AI stuff. My field is in filmmaking, and so I'm working in a very creative field. And certainly in our field, we're having these conversations about AI and the use of AI. And I am personally still I am struggling with how we how we work with it in a way that is ethical and I'm not quite sure what other word I'm looking for here. And maybe to bring it down specifically to the use of OER, you're talking about prompting and using LLMs. But my experience of LLMs right now is that they are simply scraping up my words, my individually created content,
Mhm.
or to be repurposed without any kind of copyright.
Mhm.
And so I'm very wary of it, you know, especially with things like ChatGPT or some of the others. So can you speak a little bit about how one uses, or point us to some in the direction of some LLMs or of some generative AI models that you feel are ethical?
So I think the question of what do we mean by ethical is where we have to start,
Mm.
right? When I went through graduate school, my teachers will tell you I didn't learn as much as I should have, but I learned a lot in graduate school. And I think every single resource that I read, was assigned to read, interacted with in graduate school was copyrighted. So I read all these copyrighted resources, I learned things from them, and then I went out and did things with those ideas that I learned having read all those resources. I think that's totally ethical. If I'm like quoting something or using an idea that is really somehow specific to only one individual, I should attribute that. But like the educational research textbook I shared before, there's only so many research designs in the world. There are only so many statistical tests in the world, only so many ways. I for one, look at LLMs reading and learning from copyrighted material and then turning around and doing something else with that. I see that. Now, well, let me divide it into two parts because there's actually a ruling 2 weeks ago in a court case on this involving Anthropic. The court ruled that Anthropic had done something that was okay and that they had done something wrong. First, they said that it is perfectly okay to take copyrighted materials and train a large language model on them, because that is a very transformative use. When you think about the four-part test for whether something is a fair use or not, the degree to which the use is transformative is one of the considerations there. And the court said that essentially, like, a large language model is the quintessential transformative use. So learning from copyrighted materials and then creating outputs based on what you learned from all of that reading, totally okay.